So today we're looking at how we can better manage our xAPI technical implementation projects. And we're going to do what I've been promising you for the last 6 or so weeks now. We're going to break down this super big sendStatement xAPI function into multiple smaller functions. And the main benefit of this is so that we don't have to include 10 or so arguments every time we want to execute this code from Storyline, because that just gets a bit unwieldy. And along the way, I'll show you some other things to keep in mind. So I think I'll just go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump right into this. So the first thing I wanted to show you and something to keep in mind is it's just that we want to be very particular about the verbs we decide to use in our xAPI projects. And I think I've really, nailed this. Hit this nail on the head a bunch with when we talk about verb URIs, and we don't want to use one verb to mean two different things. Like the played verb, are they playing a video or are they playing a football game? And then likewise, are we playing the video or are we watching the video? So deciding which verb to use is quite important. What I'm showing you here, this is something an early xAPI project that I put together for a client. It had some accompanying documentation, but basically they had a bunch of instructional designers and that would need to send custom xAPI statements. So I put together this Google sheet that says when to use each verb, and the user just needs to enter what video are they playing here, what module is it in, and then it will tell them what JavaScript trigger to use. So say I'm watching the xAPI video and it's in module 1. So then all they need to do is copy this code right here and paste that in Storyline, and then they use my JavaScript file. I had a JavaScript file like this and that we're going to work on today, and this is all the designer would need to do to send that xAPI statement. And I bring this up too because we were really careful in the beginning on deciding which verbs we're going to use. So it's basically like making a mini xAPI profile before you even get started on your project. You decide which verbs are we going to use and how are we going to use them. And then you would want to make that available for everyone at your organization who's using or working on these xAPI projects. Because we don't want one designer to say they're playing the video when they're starting it and someone else to say that they're watching a video when they're starting it. So those differentiations are important, and the difference between selected and answered and responded. And again, there are xAPI profiles out there that say, that will tell you how to use different verbs for domain-specific uses. But if you're just doing a small project, organization. This is like the start of an organization-specific profile, I guess, is what I'm showing here. If anyone has any questions about that, just throw it into the chat. But the real bulk of what we're doing today is we're going to break down this huge function right here into smaller functions, because you will notice in this example I showed, we're not using sendStatement and then including 10 arguments that we're sending along with it. We're only taking the arguments that we need to include for these specific functions. So for each verb, I have a unique function associated with it. So we're going to do that today. We know which verbs we're using in here. So we're using a viewed verb when they view the cheat sheet. We're using an answered verb when they select an answer. We're using a past and a failed verb, and then we have these open text questions that we could tackle if we want as well. And I think this will be a cool refresher too, because rather than copy and paste this, maybe I should just build these statements from scratch so we can see how we would do that. So looking at this code, we have all these variables and objects set up to manage our timers. So that's okay. We can leave this outside of any function because this is handling the timer at the window level. So that's fine. So we'll start beneath that. And I'm going to leave this sendStatement function here now for a reference. But once we add all the other functions we need, we'll just delete this sendStatement function. So which one should we tackle first? Do we want to tackle maybe send viewed? to handle whenever someone clicks on this cheat sheet. That might be an easy one. Okay, so let's start with that one. So I'll create a new function called sendViewed. I won't give it any arguments for now, and I'll just make it an empty function with nothing in it so far. So one more thing, I'm gonna go over to storyline, and I want to look at the JavaScript I'm executing when we do view. I'm just gonna copy this and paste it over here. You don't need to do this. This is just oh wow, that does not look good. Maybe I should just look at it over here. Okay, so the first thing we're telling this overall function is to use the viewed verb and the viewed verb ID. Well, the cool thing is we don't need to send that as an argument, because we know if we're using the send viewed function, we're going to be using the viewed verb. So let's start building out this this stuff. So we're going to need the user's name and email. So we know we're going to need these 3 lines of code right here. You know, we want to get the player, we want to get the user's name and the user's email. So we're going to need that in here regardless. We could also do this at the global level and just get the user's name and email once, but I'll show you how we'll do that with a different variable, just to show you we have options. So we see here in the main function, we're getting the user's score, the max score, the scaled score, the response. We don't need any of that when we're sending this send viewed statement. And if I'm confusing anyone, or you have any questions about what I'm doing here, just let me know. I don't want to confuse people. Okay, so just looking down in this code now to see what we can take. Look at this conf object. This is what tells us which learning record store we're talking to. Now, we can include this with every function we're going to create. But if we just want to include it once, we can take it out of this function and include it at the global level like we did with these variables. So why don't we do that? So I'm going to copy this. So where we're defining the conf object and where we're actually changing it. I'm going to copy that. And then I think I'll go right after this manage timer object. I'm going to add a couple of line breaks and I'm going to paste it. And the thing about this is instead of using the const object, we're going to use the var keyword instead of the const keyword. So this is making it a global variable, which means that inside of these functions, we'll be able to access this conf object as needed. And again, the main reason we're doing this is that we don't need to include this code in every single xAPI and every single function we're going to create. All right, so I think we are ready to move on here. I just want to make sure, I'm checking one thing really quickly. Okay, yeah, we're in good shape with that. So we have the variables we need. We've set the conf object globally, so we don't need it in these functions anymore. We see here we're doing some stuff with the final duration. That's not important for this send viewed option. But we will want the actual xAPI statement. So maybe I will just copy this since we're going to need to make a few of these functions. So I'm going to copy this big xAPI statement object that we've created over the last several weeks. Look at the last curly bracket with it and the first one. We'll actually want this result part too, but I'll just copy that next. And we'll go up into our new send viewed function and paste this code. Okay. So we're setting the statement constant. We're getting the user's name and email. That's perfect. The verb ID. So we know we're not using a verb ID this time. We're just going to take it from this execute JavaScript function. We don't need to leave it as a parameter. We do need to make sure that it is within quotes. And instead of this verb placeholder right here for this verb parameter, we're just going to make it say viewed. The stuff we just copied and pasted and moved up, do we leave it below? What stuff? Oh, this whole function we're going to delete. So you can leave stuff in here for now. It doesn't really matter. This is just kind of like our reference to make sure we're not missing anything. I think that's what you're asking. So you can leave this here. We're going to delete this sendStatement, this entire function at the end. Cool. All right. So once you've replaced these viewed options, let's look at object. So we are still going to want to know the object ID, the object description, because they might be viewing the cheat sheet on one slide, but they might be viewing a different resource on another slide. You know, we only have this cheat sheet right now. Maybe there's a cheat sheet 1 or cheat sheet 2 or xAPI cheat sheet. The verb ID and verb, well, the verb is just viewed because we're creating the send viewed function. So whenever we want to say in our course that someone viewed something, we're going, instead of the sendStatement function, we're going to use the send viewed function. And that's what we're building right now. So I just pulled the verb viewed from here. This is the code we're executing when they view the cheat sheet. And then I just pulled that verb ID from here, which originally we got from one of the registries. I can just paste this one here if you want to copy it. Since this has tincanapi.com in the ID, there's probably a more up-to-date version of this. Hopefully, maybe there's an ADL in that version. I'm not sure, but we'll just use this for now, just since we're just looking at how we can break up this function. That's the main purpose of today. And so, you know, we tell it here, this is a cheat sheet. Here's the URI for the cheat sheet. Here's the description. All of that we'll still want to leave as parameters because they might be viewing different cheat sheets or different resources. But what you notice here is for the activity type. So in our code, we have an activity type placeholder. We included this as a parameter you see here. So we know, say we're only using this viewed verb when the user views a resource. We don't need to include this one as a parameter because we know it will be a resource if they're viewing it. I'm just going to replace this. Wait, am I in the right? Yeah, in the send viewed statement, I'm going to add a quote. Surrounded by quotes, we're going to use this resource URI. Because, and again, if you're using viewed for things outside of resources, you would still need to use a parameter for this. But in this case, we're just using viewed when the user accesses any kind of resource. So we're going to just fill in this activity type ourselves. Just like how before we knew it would be an activity, so we filled that in ourselves. Okay? So moving on from there, looking at this result object, we don't need a result object to send this send viewed statement. You know, when the user is viewing a cheat sheet, we don't need to say what their score is. Okay? So I'm just going to delete this entire result object leading up to this comma right after the object. Okay, so now we have a much more concise statement, actor, verb, and object. The function is smaller too because we took out this conf object. And just to comment on this conf object again, if we wanted to send our send viewed statements to one LRS and we wanted to send our like quiz passes and fails to a different LRS, we would still want to include this in each function then, because this would be different for different functions, if that makes sense. But since we know we're going to use this same LRS for all of the statements we're going to send, we can just define this globally right here. It will set it on the window, and then everything we send after that, it will know to go to this LRS. This is standard URI for every resource. Yes, so this is an activity type. We talked about this in week 4. I don't remember if you were there, but just as a quick refresher for those who might not remember, the activity type, this is, let me show you. So there's a registry for activity types. So it would be xapi.vocab.pub. We would go to browse, and then we would go to activity types. So these are just generally like, okay, is it an assessment? An assessment is an activity type that determines a learner's mastery. So any kind of quiz or test or anything like that, you would use this URI right here as the activity type. So what we did is, in a previous week, we looked for the resource activity type. Keep searching, and here we go. It's this Tin Can API resource. A resource is a generic item that the actor may use for something. It could be, so it's a really broad URI, but it wouldn't vary based off of the learning record store you're using. You would want to use this community agreed upon verb ID, or sorry, activity type URI. We do the same thing with verbs. When we try to find a verb that the community agrees upon, we're doing the same thing with activity types. And again, this just helps other people make sense of it. They're saying, oh, they're viewing this xAPI cheat sheet. Maybe they're not familiar with the cheat sheet term. They're like, what's that? It's a resource. So again, this isn't super descriptive, but that's the idea of the activity type. So all we need to do now with this function is we need to tell it which arguments or which parameters it is accepting. So, and we can see them right here. We're getting the user's name from Storyline. We don't need a parameter from that. Same thing with the email. We're getting that from Storyline. So we just need to get the object ID, and the object description. These are the things that will vary every time we execute this function. So now when we execute it in Storyline, instead of having to include all of this stuff in quotes, we would just do this. So it would be send viewed. We would get rid of this verb and verb ID because we hard coded that in. Here we go. Cheat sheet, that's the object. So we would leave that. This cheat sheet URI, that's the object ID. So we need that. And cheat sheet in my sample quiz, that is the object description. So we need that. We don't need any of these next three. This is, the activity type. We can get rid of that. This is just a placeholder because we had some issue with our code in a previous one. We needed that placeholder. And this is telling it what timer to include. We could have built this to include a timer so we know how long someone spends on the slide before accessing this cheat sheet, but we're not going to do that right now. We'll include the timer with the quiz questions, and I'll show you how we do that. But so you see how much nicer this looks, how much more simple it is to just say, okay, yeah, we're going to use the send viewed function. We need to include the object ID, and the object description, and then we're good to go. This right here is all we would execute. Okay, so I'm going to press OK here because that's our new code. It's going to know, okay, I'm using this send viewed function. Here are the three arguments we're taking. I'm going to plop them right in here, and much more efficient, easier to use compared to this monster of a function. So that's how we're doing with that. Does anyone have any questions about what we did here with the send viewed one, or should we move on to a send answered function where we're going to include the duration and the user's response and all of that fun stuff? Okay, it's looking like there are no questions. So I think we will move on. So I'm going to press this little button right here to minimize this function. This is a feature in Visual Studio Code. And now I'm going to create a new function called sendAnswered. Again, we're not going to include any parameters at first, and we're just going to leave it as an empty function right now. Oh, I think I've left something out of this first one, actually. We need to include this bit of code right here. Constant result equals adl.xAPI wrapper.sendStatement statement. That's what's going to actually send our statement to the LRS. So that's an important piece of code. And we would include that right after we define this statement object. So it would be right before the final curly bracket closing this send viewed function, if everyone sees that. I can zoom out a little bit. Okay, so this line right here is necessary. All right, let's move along here. I'm going to minimize this, and now we're looking at send answered. So once again, we know we're going to need the user's name. Actually, it looks like we're going to need all of this stuff here. We're going to need their name, the max score, the user score, the scaled score, and we'll need even the user's response. So we'll want to tell it which variable to use. Or maybe we don't do it that way. I think someone asked in the Slack after a previous session, like, do we need to include the user's response in a variable, or can we just include it right in the function? And we can just include it right from the function. So let's do that with our sendAnswered function. Yeah, maybe we'll do a separate function for sending an open text response one, just so I can show you how we can segment this even better. So for now, this will be if they're answering a multiple choice question. So I copied all 6 of these variables that we need to establish here up front. The conf object is already decided globally, so we don't need to do that here. And now we're dealing with duration. So we do want to include duration here. So let's go ahead and copy this code as well. If you weren't here at the earlier sessions and you don't have this duration code, just try to follow along. Basically, we're just picking pieces out of this huge statement that we need for the individual statements or functions, sorry. So once again, we have this statement code. I'm going to copy all of that where we're actually defining the xAPI statement. Let's try to zoom out. See, oh, I forgot the zoom is kind of weird here. I can't just, oh, control plus minus. We want to get this big statement with this little bit of code right after it that sends the statement. So I'm going to scroll up to our new function, our sendAnswered function, and above that closing curly bracket, I'm going to paste in the xAPI statement object that we just copied. And it does have this result variable that sends the statement along with it, so that's important. So let's see what's happening now. So the verb and the verb ID, again, this is something that we can hard code into it. Okay, so because they're answering a question, so we know that they're going to be answering something. So I'm just going to grab this JavaScript right here. I'm going to copy this verb URI for answered. I'll hop back over to my code. The verb ID we'll paste right here. And then for verb, we'll just add an answered and make sure that's surrounded by quotes. Okay, so now looking in the object, once again, we have this object ID, the object description, and the activity type. So the question they're going to be answering will change. So that's what we have here for object and object ID. So it might be question 1, question 2, whatever it is. So we need to leave these as parameters, just like we did in our last function. The object description, I think for all of these, our object description is like question in Devlin's practice quiz. So maybe just to show you how we can we can leave this as a parameter, or since it's all the same in this case, we can just leave it as question in Devlin's practice quiz. So we can hard code that object description in here. And I want to show you all this because it's not super important that you're copying my code exactly as we go through it now, but it's important to see how we can, how we make the decisions between, are we going to hard code this into our statement, or is this something that we need a parameter for that can serve as a placeholder so that when we execute it from storyline, we can tell it what to include in the statement. So that's really the decisions we're trying to make here. Is this something that's not going to change, or is this something that we need to be able to change from a storyline execute JavaScript trigger? Because the cool thing is once you have your code set up how you want it and how it works for your project, it can be as simple as what we did for this. And, oh, I need to add some code here. Send viewed, object ID, object description. That's an xAPI statement that's going to get sent now. It took me 5 seconds to write. So that's the real goal we're working on here. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to use xAPI in storyline as if we were just creating a new trigger. So that's the goal. Activity type, we know this one's going to be a question. So I'm just going to copy that from this execute JavaScript trigger. Again, we got this in a previous week from that registry I just showed you earlier. I can paste this for you all. So instead of using this placeholder, we're using that question activity type. So the result object is figured out. It's grabbing all of these scores from storyline because we included these variables. Okay, the response, I want to show you really quickly. I don't think we're going to change how we did it now. But when someone answers one of these questions, what we were doing is we're setting a variable, in this case called Q1 response, equal to what the response is, in this case, A. Or in this case, for question 2, we're setting Q2 response equal to red. And then what we were doing in our JavaScript is we're telling the code which variable to get that response from. So you see here, we're including the storyline variable Q2 response. And then we have code, I'll show you, user response equals player.getVar uResponse. And that uResponse is the parameter where we're passing this variable name in. So in this case, it's going to know that the user selected red because it's getting the variable that's holding the value because we set it equal to red. Someone pointed out we don't actually need to include it as a variable. If we set up our code a little bit differently, we could have just sent this directly to the xAPI statement. So say this was user response, we could just include uResponse down here in the response object, but then we wouldn't be able to include it as a variable. We would have to actually type in whatever it would be, like red in this case, instead of the variable holding the user's response. The reason we did it the way we did it is so that we can reuse our code, because these open text response questions, they have to have unique variables to even be recorded by storyline. So you see here, we're setting a variable called user's favorite part equal to a typed value. And for this next question, user's least favorite part. So we already had that functionality working to put the correct value in this result.response property. So we just kept that going. Now, what we could do now is for our regular send answered function, we could have it so that it just takes that user's response and puts it directly in the xAPI statement. But I'm thinking, since we already have all this functionality set up and we already created variables to hold the response to each of these questions, there's really not a big point to create two separate functions, like one for send multiple choice answered and one for send open response answered. So I think we'll just use this send answered function for any kind of questions like this. So if you have questions about my explanation or anything like this, or you do think it would be valuable to see me building two separate functions, let me know. But I don't want to create more work for us unnecessarily right now. It's the how we're doing this it's most important. So let's see. So send answered, yeah, we're just going to keep this. I'm just going to copy this code back in here. The constant user response equals player.getVar uResponse. And that's what's going to get the user's response from that storyline variable for us. But this is going to be what the parameter is. That's what's going to be what we include up here. So anyway, let's see what else we need here. So we're getting the user's response now. That's why I had that long-winded explanation. We want to know whether the question is correct. Yeah, we'll probably still want to include a parameter for that, so we can easily include this true or false right here to tell us whether or not they got the question correct. So we'll leave that. And then final duration. So we will want to know the duration. That's important. But you notice when we set up this function, we included this function as part of this larger function, of this sendStatement function. So I think what this means is that we're not going to be able to use this function outside of the function that we defined it in. So we need to copy this function that I pasted for you last week. And instead of including it in this really big sendStatement function, we need to bring it into the global scope. So an easy way to do that is I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to skip a few lines at the end, and I'm just going to paste it right here at the bottom of my code. So now that it's outside, oh, wait a minute. Actually, I see why we used it inside the code, because we pass. Let me see. 1 second. Sorry about this. Sorry, I didn't do a ton of planning on this because I thought it would be valuable figuring this one out together. So what we do is we're telling it which seconds variable we want to convert to this ISO 8601 format. So for people who weren't here for the duration tutorial, this is just a function I wrote. We didn't really spend much time going through it. It basically converts a raw number of seconds into hours, minutes, and seconds in a duration that the LRS would accept. So what's going on is we used a parameter to tell our function whether we should get the slide seconds or the overall course seconds. Because like when someone finished our course and passed the quiz, we would want to know how long they spent in the entire course. But when someone just answered a question, we want to know how long they spent on that specific slide. So the cool thing now is we don't need a parameter for that, because when someone's answering a question, we know we're going to want the number of slide seconds. And when they are when they're passing the quiz, we know we're going to want the course seconds. So we can still do what I was saying, because this is just a parameter. So when we call this, when we execute this function, we'll tell it whether we want to take the seconds, the number of slide seconds, or the number of course seconds. So we can still do what I was saying. It's still going to work. So let's just copy this function. Make sure you're not copying extra curly brackets. Visual Studio Code is nice because it highlights the bracket associated with the end of this function if you select the first one. So I'm just going to start there and copy this. I'm going to paste it outside at the bottom. And now we'll be able to use this convert to ISO function in any of our other functions, since it's in the global scope and it's outside of any specific function. So scrolling back up to this new one we've been working on, this sendAnswered function. The duration right here is set to final duration. So looking up here, we copied this code, let final duration, and then we said, oh, if the timer is equal to course, we're going to use this code, or if the timer is equal to slide, we're going to use this code. Well, since we're answering a question, we know that we want that slide timer. So I'm going to copy this right here where it says final duration equals convert to ISO slide seconds. I'm going to copy that. And I'm just going to overwrite this where it says final duration next to let. I'm going to paste it. And then I'll delete these if statements beneath it. And I'll show you this. Maybe that sounded confusing. But this is all we're doing. We're letting this final duration variable be equal to the number of slide seconds, which we keep track of globally up here at the very, very top. We set up an interval to add 1 to that timer every second. So we're saying in this new function, the final duration is equal to the number of slide seconds, and we use this function to convert it to a format that will be accepted by our xAPI statement. So we don't need those if statements. We don't have to include up here, oh, take the course timer, take the slide timer, because we know with this function, we're going to want the course timer or the slide timer. Sorry. Does anyone want to let me know in chat how we're doing with this? Is anyone following me? Are we doing okay? Because I can move through this more slowly if we need to, or. And we have final duration included here for the duration. So the value of this variable is included in our xAPI statement. So that's good to go. You're with me? Okay, good. Okay, nice. So yeah, if you're following me, I think it speaks a lot to how far we've come here, because this is like some full-blown coding JSON stuff we're working with. So good stuff if you're following all of this. All right. So now that we've built this function, we need to figure out which parameters we actually need to include here. So basically, what do we need to tell the statement when we execute it from storyline that we haven't already included here? So we've got the name covered, we've got the email covered, the verb and the verb ID, we hard-coded those in, so that's good. The object and the object ID, we still have parameters for that. So let's add those parameters, object, object ID. Yes, we did redo the move. Sorry, I backtracked for a second. Sorry, this is for Nicole. We did move this convert to ISO function outside of the function that it was contained within. I didn't delete it from here because, again, we're going to delete this entire sendStatement function, but we want to make sure that this one is just living at the bottom of our code outside of any curly brackets. It's its own function out here. So that then when we execute it from our new function right here, convert to ISO, it has access to that function because it's not locked within another function. And at the same time, that means we don't have to include that other function inside every new function we create where we want to send the duration or collect the duration. Cool. Okay, so we know we need the object and object ID parameters. We don't need the description because we're telling it it's a question in Devlin's practice quiz. We don't need the activity type because we know it's a question. The max score, the user score, the scaled score, and okay, these first three we've covered with variables. Let's look at the user response. So this is showing us it's a variable, but the constant user response is equal to player.getVar uResponse, which is a parameter. We need to include that as a parameter because we need to still tell this function which storyline variable we're getting the value from to include in our xAPI statement. So we do need this uResponse parameter because we're going to be, that's going to vary based off of which question we're answering. Okay, we also have down here this QCorrect. That's the question. That's short for question correct. So since that will vary based off of which option they select, we do need to still include that as a parameter. We can't say that's for sure going to be false or for sure going to be true. And finally, final duration, we've got that taken care of with this variable right here. We know that we need the slide seconds, so we do not need a parameter telling us whether to include the course duration or the slide duration. So look at that. I mean, even for this answered one, we cut down all of these arguments. Literally, there's so many, to 4. Now when we execute, let's look at what it takes to execute this code from Storyline now. So for choice A here, we're going to look at the JavaScript. So we don't need these first two pieces. We don't need this answered verb or this answered verb ID. Speak, that is true. Yes. All of the key value pairs. So look here. So he's asking, are all of these key value pairs we're using like actor, name, mbox, verb, ID, display? Yeah, these are all decided on by the xAPI spec, and how they can, the format for the values, this is also decided on. We have to have this language code here. This has to be in this URI/URL format. All of this stuff is set by the spec. But if you want to add something that isn't set by the spec, like additional information, you can add that using extensions. And extensions, for extensions, the key will be a URI that you or your organization decides upon. So I can pull up an example really quick. I haven't done much work with this, but I've seen it a lot. So look at this. So say you want to add a starting point and an ending point for your course. You can do that if you setting your own extension URI, and then you can set that equal to a number. You can set that equal to a string. So you can include extra information like that. So say I wanted to include, what's something we would want to include here? An extension about, I don't know. Maybe for every statement we send, we want to send an extension saying how confident the user is in their xAPI abilities. Maybe we gave them like a survey at the beginning saying, rate your confidence on these 10 xAPI skills, 1 through 10. And then say for some reason, for every statement we send about dealing with xAPI stuff, we want to send extensions with their responses to each of those questions. We would be able to do that. We would just we would create a URI for each of those questions, And then the value would be, 8 confidence or 7 or 5 or 4. And so look here, the extensions property can be used in multiple locations within a statement. So the activity definition, so let's see. So here's the activity definition right here. So it's saying we can add extensions. I'm thinking this is, again, I haven't done this before, but based off of what I just read, it seems like this is where we would add it. So then we would add, extensions related to the activity there. You can add it in the context object or the result object. Okay, so this is obviously kind of a pivot. So you see the result object, we have this here. It's saying we can add extensions here as well. And I don't know if we need this extensions object actually, or if we can just directly add the extensions like sample.com/confidence. I don't know if we can just set that exactly like 1. So this is the format that the extension would be in, but it would probably, let's see if we can find a good example. Oh, okay. So you do need this extensions object, it looks like. So that's something to look into further. I haven't had a need to use this yet, but I have directed people to this resource. So it sounds like a good opportunity for a tutorial in the future. Once I play around with it a bit and test it out with an LRS. Anyway, sorry for that sidestep. I know I've gotten some questions about that, so maybe it was helpful for some of you. But let's see, we need to finish. Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to show you how we can execute this now. So we need the object ID, the U response, and Q correct. So we have question 1 is the object here. Here's the object ID. The object description we don't need because we hard-coded that into the statement. The activity type we also do not need because we hard-coded that. Q1 response, we do need that. That is this U response argument we're passing. We're telling it which variable holds this response. And we don't need to tell it to include this slide timer at the end. We do need to include false because in this case, choice A is incorrect. So do you see how and then it's not send statement, it is send answered. So that we just turned that huge block of code. Oh, it's not letting us. I'm gonna cancel it. So we turned this into this. You see how much easier this is to work with if you take the upfront time and get this function set up how we want it. It's kind of, it's like night and day. So now when we want to copy this down the line, so choice A, choice B, choice C. Let's see, I'm just going to copy send answered. Now it's question 2. And it's Q1 response, and this one's wrong as well. So it's so easy, so it's so much easier and easier to work with. So this one, it's still, oh, I didn't even need to change that actually in this one. I did that wrong. It's not question 2, it's still question 1. So I just literally need to paste it. It's the same thing. But only this last one, instead of false, we're setting it to true. So I can do the same thing for question 2 now. It's not question 1, it is question 2 this time. And Q2 response. I'm going to copy that one and paste it down. So this blue is the correct one here, so we'll change this to true. And for yellow, and this is the same thing, I don't even have to change anything. Yeah, the ones for question 1 are the same. The only thing you need to keep track of to change is the last argument you're passing. It needs to be false for the incorrect options and true for the correct options, because we already made it to change the variable. So you see here, we're setting Q1 response to A, to B, or to C using storyline triggers. So if we use the other approach where we didn't have this response stored in a variable, we would have to change the JavaScript to say the actual user's response. But instead it's in a variable, so we just have to paste this code. So I think I did it all for question 2. Now I just need to do the same thing for question 3. Yeah, I think some of you were watching me edit code like this before, and I mean, I hope it's obvious how much more straightforward this is here. So question B here looks like it's the correct one, so we'll change it to true. So there we go. So we just replaced those functions for the answered ones. So that's perfect. Now the last ones I want to do are a failed and a passed one. Okay. So I'm going to try to do this really quickly just so I can, feel free to follow along. You don't have to, but I want to show you, I just want to do this last, function send failed. And let's see how quickly we can do this one. So we know we need the player, the name, the email, the score. We don't need a user response. Yeah, we do not need the user's response. We do want the final duration, so I'm going to copy that one as well. But instead of making the final duration slide seconds, we want to grab the final duration from the course seconds variable. And we can see this up here at the top. Course seconds, that's going to hold the time, how many seconds the user has spent in the entire course. So when we're failing or passing the quiz, we want to know how long they spent in the entire thing, not just on that slide. Okay, so we hard-coded that in. What else do we need here? Let's see. So I'm going to copy, let's see. I'm going to copy the xAPI statement, not from the send viewed, but from send answered. Just like before, I'm going to copy this big xAPI statement up through this line of code where we're setting the result variable that's actually sending the statement. Okay, and now also like before, let's start seeing what we need here. So we're not using the send answered verb, we're using the send failed verb. So I'm just going to grab that verb ID from this failed layer that we set up previously. I'm going to swap out answered for this failed verb, change answered to failed. Object ID and object. If there were multiple quizzes in this course, we would want to leave that as a parameter. But just to show you this, we can even hard code. Oh, well, we have quiz 1 and quiz 1. So we'll just leave that since, there may be multiple things you pass and fail. But you see, we could just hard code in quiz 1 right here. But then if we want to use this JavaScript file on like another project, we would have to jump back into the code and hard code it. And we might not want to do that. So we'll leave those as placeholders. So question and Devlin's sample quiz, we'll just make this Devlin's practice quiz. It's not a question activity type, it's an assessment. So I'm going to copy this code from here. It's an assessment. So here's where we're getting all the score information. That's fine. We'll leave that here. The user's response, we do not need that because no one's actually submitting a response to the quiz. You submit a response to a specific question. So we're going to get rid of that response key value pair. Success, since we know that they're failing this, we can put false because we know it's not successful because we're only executing this function when the user fails the quiz. And then final duration, we've already set to get the number of course seconds. So that's all we need. So now we need to actually put the parameters. So we know we want the object ID, and that's all for this one, right? Yeah. So we only need the object and object ID now for this send failed function. So I'm going to look over here. I do not need to tell it which verb to use, and I do not need to tell it which timer to take, which response to use, which activity type, or the description. So this is all. Oh, and then instead of send statement, it's send failed. Okay. So that's all we need to do for that. I'm going to press OK here. It's just passing in the object and the object ID, which are those parameters we're taking. So I think I'm just going to copy this entire function right here. Okay, come on. It's kind of jumpy. Okay, I'm copying the send failed function. Let me zoom out. You see that? And I'm just going to go right. I'm going to close it a little bit, and I'm just going to paste a new function beneath it. This is going to be the send past function. Okay, so same stuff here. Final duration is course seconds. Yes. We're not going to use the failed verb. We're going to use the past verb. I'll go ahead and grab the verb URI from the past execute JavaScript trigger. Object ID and object, those are placeholders. That's good. It's still an assessment activity type. It's still Devlin's practice quiz for the object description. And success instead of false, we need to make that true. And then we have our code to send that statement, and we are in good shape. So all we need to do now, well, one, I'm going to delete this sendStatement function, the huge one that we had from before. And this is all of our code now. So we have the timer stuff up here. We're setting this conf object. We have our send viewed, our send answered, our send failed, and our send past functions that we can make bigger, but I'm just going to leave them minimized. And then we have this helper function down here that takes our number of raw seconds and converts it into this right format to be accepted by our xAPI, by our learning record store, basically. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to condense down this function that we're executing on the past layer to get rid of all this stuff we don't need, just like we did with failed. And this should be good to go. So we didn't get down here. We don't have time for that. I just want to publish this and show you. I mean, hopefully it works. We're going to test it out really quickly. I didn't replace. Oh yeah, so I only replaced the send viewed on this first question. So I'll make sure we test it there. So let's see if we did this right. We changed a lot. When you're editing code like this, the odds are usually that you messed something up and forgot some sort of bracket or comma or something. We're going to keep our fingers crossed here and hope that that's not the case. You lost the ability, Nicole, to collapse the functions. That may mean that you forgot a curly bracket somewhere. So make sure you have that opening curly bracket and that closing curly bracket. If you can't collapse this one, it probably means that it can't find a corresponding closing bracket. So this bracket right here should close the statement object. There should be this result variable and then this closing bracket. But let's do this. You all have seen me do this many times now. We're going to open this output folder, open the story.html file with code. I'm going to save this xAPI statement file, and then I'm going to do save as and navigate to our new output, which is right here. I'm going to save it there. And now I'm going to just navigate to last week's output from the duration tutorial. I'm going to copy the xAPI wrapper.min.js file, paste it in here, open up this old story.html file, scroll to the bottom to copy these script tags, scroll to the bottom of the new file, and paste those script tags right above the closing body tag. I know I move fast through that. I can explain it more, but we've been doing this process every week, so I think you get the idea. Let's see if this works. I'm going to open my console just to see if we got any errors right off the bat. We didn't. That's a good sign. I'm going to sign into my LRS. It is our Crowdcast test LRS. We will go to this data. And let's see what we can do here. So our name now will be Devlin statement or Devlin function, since we made a bunch of functions. Okay, let's view the cheat sheet. We'll close it. We'll select choice A. Let's see how we're doing so far. Okay, and it's working so far. Devlin viewed the cheat sheet. Devlin answered question 1. This is a good sign. We'll answer these 2 correctly, B and B. I failed because I answered question 1 incorrectly. Let's see, do we have all of these statements? Yep, Devlin answered question 1, question 2, question 3, and then failed the quiz. Let's configure this. We'll add the success property. Let's add the score property and the response property. Sure enough, here we go. All of the stuff is here just like it was before. I answered question 1 incorrectly, so the success is false. Questions 2 and 3 correctly, so it's true. You can see the response here, A, blue, and 45. My score is a 33% after I answered question 2 correctly, 66% once I answered question 3 correctly, and I failed the quiz with a score of 66%. So we did it. That's all there is to it. These functions are so much nicer to look at in Storyline, so much easier to use. But it obviously does require a deeper understanding of the code to get to that point and make it so easy in Storyline. But I mean, if you get a solid handle of this and clients need xAPI services, you can charge good money to put something together like I showed you earlier. I mean, that's all I did. I set up functions like this. I mean, I used some extra JavaScript so that if someone puts one or I use some JavaScript to accept things and kind of like make sure it gets it into the right format to account for user error. But something like this, I think, following the steps that you learned here, you can set something like this up for a client or for a colleague. So you can set up all the code and tell them how to use the functions, and all they have to do is this part and copy the files into the output folder. And I mean, that's way easier to do than to go through 10 weeks of these xAPI tutorials and learn how to actually execute this stuff and learn how to actually write this code and play around with this code yourself. So this is a really valuable skill if you get the hang of this and you can make those calls about, what are we going to include in this function? What are we not going to include in this function? And when should these functions be used? Which storyline actions should trigger them?